Here to talk about decentralized identity and DeFi is Isaac Patka of Bloom, which is a product I've been following since the very beginning. Very excited to hear and learn so much from Isaac in the next 18 or so minutes. Isaac,
thank you. Yeah, thanks for welcoming me to ETHDenver. Really excited to be here again, this time virtually. I was listening to Chip's talk on Streamer, and I couldn't think of like a better intro into kind of what we'll be talking about next. So what I'm most interested in is the intersection of the decentralized identity spaces and the maturing DeFi space. And so these two things have been maturing independently for a number of years. And I think that really now is the time that we can start bringing them together and seeing a lot of value. So the analogy that I'm thinking of, which should help here, is that people often talk about DeFi Legos, where you can stitch together things like credit delegation and flash loans and CDPs and decentralized exchanges to build all sorts of really creative new financial instruments. On the identity side, we've also been kind of putting together a lot of different pieces like DIDs and identity wallets, encrypted data vaults, protocols for cross-company presentation exchanges. So the analogy that I'm hoping to try out here is that we've been building these identity mega blocks, which are kind of off-brand Legos, and we've got Legos, the DeFi Legos, and what we don't have is a very easy way to kind of piece everything together. So when I talk about the decentralized identity space and what we've been accomplishing, there's in the US and in abroad, specifically a lot in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of these companies rolling out the concept of verifiable credentials, which give people self-custody of information about themselves that they can prove without having to go back to some sort of central body like a credit bureau or even like a Google or Facebook for OAuth. So these are people that are traditionally unbanked or underemployed, or in the current situation, unable to travel or very restricted movement-wise. And so what we're starting to see is a lot of decentralized identity applications giving people the ability to solve problems with data. So this is I'm just so excited about the last few years, the amount of companies that are now supporting these open and interoperable standards. It was actually 2 years ago at ETHDenver when I signed into the ETHDenver hackathon with the Uport identity wallet, when I realized like, whoa, like, why are we not interoperable with these folks? So ETHDenver was actually a big turning point for how we were thinking about identity with Bloom. So now you can see, this is just a screenshot I took recently of all the members of the Decentralized Identity Foundation. There's also groups like Trust Over IP, the W3C Credentials Community Group. There's so many people in the decentralized identity space that are working on the problems of, on the solutions for self-custody of verifiable information. Meanwhile, everyone here is more familiar with DeFi, right? Like I used the same graphic a few months ago in a talk, and I had to take another snapshot because it just dwarfed the amount of money that's been pouring into DeFi. And the amount of products and interesting things that are launching every week. The pace is just incredible of what's going on in DeFi. However, a lot of the products in DeFi are still things like ways that you can do margin trading or locking up your assets and borrowing against them. A lot of it's still based on the fundamental concepts of like trustlessness and just protocol and code is king. So what we've been doing in identity is not that unrelated, but it's not exactly on chain. Like if you remember the first iterations of the Bloom smart contracts that I was working on, we had the concept of like an Ethereum address has a certain has like a type of data, like a phone number, and the hash of that phone number is this. Like every single piece of information was directly tied to an Ethereum address, and while the data was obfuscated, there were still definitely some privacy issues. So the way that the identity space has been moving is still using like public-private keys and wallets like Bitcoin and Ethereum wallets, but the protocols have scaled in a very different way. At most, the only thing that you'll see on chain is like an IPFS document hash, which represents all of the document updates that happened in the last hour or something. So what I have on the right is a graphic that shows the sidetree protocol. So sidetree is something that is being worked on by quite a few diff members, including Transmute and Microsoft. And these folks are, and we're also supporting it now too, you can either use like a Bitcoin key or an Ethereum key. And basically the point of it is it's more than an identity tied to just an Ethereum address. It's tied to a universal identifier, which is linked to a public-private key. And by having it on this on the sidetree protocol, you can have certain features like updating keys, rotating keys, delegating things, adding service endpoints, which are like where you store your data. So these are all things that are enabled by the same core public-private keys as the rest of crypto, but it's not like you can query identity information from within a smart contract. It's really just using the ledger as a timestamping mechanism. These two spaces are very complementary. So the DeFi space has a trust problem in that every lending protocol either requires over-collateralization or instant payback. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem because the applications you can build on that are amazing. But if you actually want to start building consumer lending products, consumer banking products, will be limited both by regulation, compliance, and the fact that there's a completely trustless nature to Ethereum addresses. On the decentralized identity space, we're actually also seeing a major challenge, which is what I'm calling an adjacency problem. One of the core value props of decentralized identity is that you get the information verified once, and then you can share it as many times as you want. All of the pilots that even the top decentralized identity companies are doing, no one's really proven out that adjacency value prop yet. It's more like, these things are working within a specific silo. So an example is like if a hospital that rolls out an identity system to manage their employees' credentials, which I think is something that Evernym is working on, it still is basically from hospital to hospital. I don't think any of those people can then have taken their doctor credential status and use it in a completely unrelated application, even though through the nature of this technology, that's a totally legitimate use case. So by bringing together the fact that DeFi needs verifiable self-custody data and decentralized identity needs more use cases for us to actually be able to onboard more issuers of these attestations or credentials, they work really well together. And this graphic is my poor attempt to tie them together with like a bloom-colored square. So what type of data do we have now in the decentralized identity space? We spent a lot of time working on protocols and schemas and IDs and just the general transport layer, but now we're actually starting to see data flow in. So there's two, so IATA and Affinity and actually a number of others are working on wallets that will enable people to travel if they can show negative COVID test results and vaccination status. The immediate benefit here is that you can make health data more portable by, there's all these laws around like, if you get a test for your COVID results issued in like Malaysia, if you go to the border, it's actually considered like a data export if like these two services are talking to each other. By actually giving the data to people and holding it in their hands, you can get around a lot of the complex like data regulations governing what data can be imported and exported between countries. This is just one use case. Like I'm saying, like, this allows people to travel, but what can you do now if you now have a system where labs can issue portable verifiable health records? It doesn't just end with COVID test results. You can make any sort of health data compatible in this format. And we've built it using like FHIR schemas, which are already natively compatible with electronic health records. Similarly, for employment information, I mentioned like something that Evernym's been talking about in inter-hospital authentication of health professionals. So Dr. A wants to go from hospital 1 to 2, and they don't want to have to revet all of their licenses. They can custody all of this information and bring it over. And on Bloom, what we've been focusing on, is like credit, income, and KYC data. So we have a deep integration into Transunion, which allows us to pull people's credit data directly down to their device. We don't see it. Transunion doesn't know what you're doing with it. Basically, you can pull your credit data onto the device, get a credential that represents what creditworthiness bucket you fit into, and then there's all sorts of eligibility screening and offer engines and whitelisting you can do directly on device. Currently, most of our users really just use this for monitoring their credit as a more private alternative to things like Credit Karma or NerdWallet. But what we want to see is people actually using this credit data to make people eligible for unsecured lending products. This involves building a bridge, the same kind of bridges that you heard about in the last talk, but with some more details on like kind of how we're building these bridges. This is where a lot of our development is focused now. The left-hand side of the screen is showing how issuers give data to consumers and allow them to self-custody things about their job, their education, their medical history. They store it in an identity wallet that gets stored encrypted in a data vault, and then they can share it freely. In order for them to actually share that with a DeFi application, you need some sort of anonymization layer, some sort of incentive mechanism. And so there's a number of ways to do that. The default that I think about is just a Chainlink oracle making this data somewhat anonymized, saying that this address falls into this sort of bucket. You can build a data feed like that, and we've built proof of concept data feeds like that. Something that I did for the Market Make hackathon was actually use this data to mint NFTs. So what we did was, based on your creditworthiness profile, we would mint a NFT that represented something that could be redeemed for a loan at a certain interest rate and at a certain limit. And then it would automatically open up a credit line for you using Aave credit delegation. So we've got oracles, we've got NFTs. There's all sorts of applications with like Enigma secret contracts that we could do, or any of these other data protocols I'd be happy to develop an adapter for. The key thing here is that any data that is flowing into the decentralized identity space can easily be made accessible and queryable in the DeFi space. This is the example of what I was just talking about. We just finished this hackathon earlier this week. In fact, the finale was just this morning, where we worked with a team to build something called Credit 3. So the idea here is that we could have investors that deposit stablecoins into an Aave lending pool, where they're getting at least the base return interest there, and then qualified risk assessors can use the data that we've gathered off-chain to issue loans to certain individuals that meet the certain qualifications, and then all the investors in the pool can actually receive a premium interest on top of the base lending pool rate. So borrowers can receive NFTs from risk assessors, which are redeemable for loans. Investors get lending pool interest plus premium interest from borrowers, and risk assessors can actually compete with each other to see who is the best risk assessor, risk pricer for loans and customers. This is something that could easily in the future be integrated into an alternative to something like Affirm, where if you're buying your Peloton and it says pay $50 a month for a year, you could actually open up that credit line easily using the combination of DeFi Legos and our identity blocks. This is just, I like to show exactly what it looks like. So this was, this is the app that allows you to see, these are the different attributes you have about yourself, identity documents, like sanction screens, like social media accounts, a credit tab with actually like live data being pulled directly from Transunion. And then just with a simple QR or button scan, you can share it with the page. And then whatever address I have associated with my wallet would be then made available in the Chainlink Oracle or minting an NFT. There's another thing that I think would be really interesting, which we've been exploring with regulators, primarily in the US. I'm the co-chair of the DIF Banking and Finance Special Interest Group, where we talk about different ways that we can introduce this technology to make it easier for banks to handle their customer data in a more privacy-preserving way. One of the really interesting things we learned is that we brought on a lawyer who was involved in the early 2000s of actually writing the customer identification program in the US to talk about like what are the actual laws that crypto exchanges and banks have to abide by in order to make sure that they are not causing money laundering or facilitating money laundering or terrorist financing. And what we learned was that there is no law on the books that says every institution you do business with needs to have a copy of your personal information. The fact that when you go to Kraken, Coinbase, Gemini, or participate in an ICO, the fact that you have to share your identity information with each of them is just because they're not connected. But there is no law that says that they each need a copy of your data. It's perfectly legal for there to be some sort of consortium of identity providers just to make it so that somebody can raise a flag and say, this transaction looks suspicious. I know who this wallet belongs to. maybe they're doing money laundering, or maybe they're financing like terrorist groups or something. It's just that somebody needs that information about you, but we can do it in a much more privacy-preserving way that's done now. You shouldn't have to take a picture of your license every time you want to use a new application in crypto. So there's all sorts of really cool stuff I want to see built here. We started funding a lot of grants in the space just this week. We closed applications last week, and we have companies that are coming in to build unsecured lending products, different like tokenomics research projects. What I would love to see is like, as some of you know, like Bloom's been around in the space for a few years, started off as a token sale, but the initial value prop of the token was a network currency of like BLT as this network currency. But when we actually started integrating with these different data contracts with the Transunions and the Acuants and all the companies, pretty hard sell to get them to say, okay, now it's a competitive marketplace where you're buying and selling data with a token. What I would love to see is there a way that we could advance the original vision of like the token, the protocol, this whole decentralized identity ecosystem to do things like governing lending vaults, unsecured lending protocols, DeFi, something at the intersection between these two spaces. I know that's a little vague, but that's kind of what we're exploring and researching now, and we're opening up a lot of new grants and opportunities there. I think that if we do solve these problems of bridging DeFi and decentralized identity, we can create an entirely new class of products like different on-ramps for centralized finance users to get access to crypto lending and investing opportunities. So yeah, these are some links. Please join us. Like this is all research that we're conducting now, that we're fostering in the community. Yeah, and I'm really excited to see what you guys can do with this information.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. That was brilliant. We learned a lot here, and we saw in the comments some people. I just want to ask you one last question before we let you go. People were saying that identity can be used for or against you, and people are concerned that perhaps the same. Here we go. This is the comment here. You can read it yourself. What do you think? What do you have to say to this commenter?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with the premise that like having this knowledge about who you're dealing with, it can work for or against you. Like if you're either trying to skirt certain things about the system, or if there are certain products that you want to have access to that that legally you might not have access to, if people kind of know who you are and able to track this down, people can kind of gather information about you behind the scenes and start understanding things about your activity that you would not necessarily want them to know. So I think of identity as like a very fragmented concept. And at the core of the decentralized identity space, we have this concept of like selective disclosure, where you really should only have to share just the minimum amount of information that the counterparty needs to feel comfortable doing business with you. And the fact that that's kind of baked into the core fundamentals and like ethos of the system gives me some comfort. But it's definitely a good point that we shouldn't, just because it's now a decentralized credential, you shouldn't just have to share all the same information that you did before. You should be able to break it down into like sub-credentials and use selective disclosure to make sure that you're really only sharing what you need for people to feel comfortable doing business with you.
Well, to feel comfortable, and also perhaps the minimum to meet statutory requirements.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Isaac, thanks so much for coming on here and educating us about decentralized identity and where we stand in 2021. Is of course a core piece of the DeFi stack, as you described with your smart blocks and Lego blocks at the very early on. So thanks again.